Central America like you might think. Its effects have spread to the United States, where the Salvadoran gang MS-13 has grown exponentially. Meanwhile, the solution to destroying these gangs has forced us to ask uncomfortable questions about choosing between freedom and security. El Salvador itself is not a large country at only 21,000 square kilometers, making it roughly the size of my state of New Jersey. With 6.5 million people living in El Salvador, the nation is the smallest yet most densely packed country in all of Central America. Part of the El Salvador geopolitical importance comes from the fact that they're located on the coast of the Pacific near important shipping lanes, and they neighbor countries that are close to the Panama Canal. Instability could and has in the past quickly overflowed into neighboring countries. El Salvador is way more closely entwined with the United States than you might think. Total trade between the two was $6.7 billion in 2021, and 2.5 million Salvadorans call the United States home. Remittances from Salvadorans who live and work in the United States totaled a whopping $7.1 billion in 2021. That's equal to 25% of El Salvador's total GDP. Due in part to this, the United States and El Salvador are tied by the hip in an economic common law union. The relationship between them is so tight that El Salvador was actually one of the only Latin American nations to join the United States military coalition in the 2003 war in Iraq. If that's not in sickness and health, I don't know what is. Looks in poverty. Stability in El Salvador is pretty important to the United States for a few big reasons. One of them being that El Salvador's international airport is one of only two in all of Latin America that the U.S. military is authorized to conduct anti-narcotic missions from. The U.S. also has an interest in keeping immigration levels at a certain rate, and violence and instability in El Salvador can send those rates skyrocketing up. Nearly 20,000 people were killed in El Salvador by gang violence from 2014 to 2017. Around 20% of the country's citizenry now live abroad in other Latin American countries and the United States. By the end of 2022, the global number of asylum seekers and refugees from El Salvador had reached 200,000 people. So what steps were taken to help keep El Salvador stable? U.S. military assistance to El Salvador was about $15 million between 2016 and 2020 to help address the gang violence. But in 2020, that aid stopped, partly because of criticisms about a perception that El Salvador was sliding into authoritarianism. The reason for that slide has to do with their fight against gang violence. So what sparked all this violence in El Salvador in the first place? How did homicides reach a peak in 2015 at a rate of 106 per 100,000 residents? The answer is, of course, widely debated. El Salvador's history is plagued by instability, corruption, and violent conflict that all combine to supercharge the gang problem. But I think one of the root causes of the instability in El Salvador has to do with your favorite drink. Coffee. Yes, that sweet, bitter nectar of the gods. The only kind of woke I want to be. Caffeine woke. Because in the late 1800s, the coffee industry boomed in El Salvador. Coffee brought in 95% of El Salvador's GDP at that point. But this created a problem because this income was largely restricted to just the part of the population that already owned land. This made a terrible divide. 77% of the arable land belonged to 0.1% of the population. In 1821, El Salvador gained independence from Spanish colonial rule. Starting in 1930, the country was ruled by a series of military dictatorships. According to this old New York Times article that I dug up from 1977, the army-backed government of President Arturo Armando Molina announced a land reform project that called for large land holdings to be redistributed to the peasant population. But these reforms might have been doomed to fail because the landowners were like, yeah, we're not giving away our farms, which caused widespread anger towards the government. That anger grew from the 1960s to the 1980s into far-left and far-right movements. This set the stage for the Cold War, where El Salvador became the perfect candidate for the competition between the United States and Soviet Union. Let's take a look at my average infantryman Cold War bingo card. We've got all the classic Cold War factors at play here, including an arms race funded by superpowers, ideological battle of communism versus democracy, a history of European colonialism, far-left Marxist groups, far-right death squads. Now all they need is a brutal civil war. The Communist Soviets And Cuba sent 800 tons of weapons that flooded El Salvador with the means for rebellion. And Iraq sent $500,000 to the far-left organizations in El Salvador for them to violently overthrow the government and redistribute the wealth. These weapons were secretly funneled into El Salvador by the Soviet Union. These weapons and all future support sent by the Soviets was dwarfed in comparison to what the United States government sent. It was about $1 to $2 million per day worth of weapons, training, and equipment sent by the U.S. government to El Salvador's military and security forces, to a total of $6 billion. The School of the Americas has trained more than 46,000 Latin military officers since the end of World War II. On October 29, 1979, a military coup in the country ousted the serving president, Carlos Humberto Romero, whose election was widely considered to be fraudulent. The El Salvador Civil War broke out in 1980 between the two main groups. It was Farabundo Martí National Liberation Front, or the FMLN, that's the Marxist-Leninist guerrilla forces, versus the U.S.-backed El Salvador government. The two sides fought across the country, each trying to impose their will on the divided nation. The UN independent investigation estimates between 37,000 to 65,000 civilians lost their lives in this war. You'll hear the killings done by the far-left groups called terrorism and the killings done by the far-right groups called death squads, who were reportedly responsible for a majority of the casualties. This caused an immense amount of economic and social upheaval in the country, destroying communities and displacing more than 1 million people. The death squad's response to the revolution was so brutal that the U.S. government and the public became concerned about being associated with them. The U.S. Senate even went so far as to commission this 17-page investigation into whether military support and training was directly or indirectly fueling these atrocities. The vast majority of students come from just one country, El Salvador, and war with Marxist guerrillas. I read through the findings and I wasn't surprised to learn that they said nothing illegal is done, but if you read in between the lines, it does repeatedly advise how closely connected these death squads were to El Salvador's government forces. In hindsight, historians today widely believe the U.S. military training and weapons indirectly went to these death squads. Over 500,000 of these refugees totally fled the country entirely to escape the brutal conflict, with many making their way to the United States and especially to the city of Los Angeles. The city of LA was already in the midst of gang crisis of their own at the time. The vulnerable Salvadoran newcomers were routinely targeted by the existing gangs in the city. In this dog-eat-dog world of 1980s Los Angeles, a few disaffected youths of the Salvadoran immigrant community decided the best thing to do to protect themselves and their families was to make a gang of their own, forming the roots of what would become Mara Salvatrucha, also known as the MS-13 gang. Exactly where that name came from and what it means is unknown, and you can ask 4 different people and get 8 different answers, but there's no doubt that MS-13 quickly morphed from a desire for mutual protection into a brutal criminal enterprise of its own. An early leader of the gang, Ernesto Diaz, was a former member of El Salvador's Special Forces and used his military experience to whip the gang into a more organized and deadly structure. The Soviet and American funding of the war in El Salvador had made its way back to the United States. Okay, so this brings us almost full circle. How did an LA street gang called MS-13 then become one of the deadliest in Central America? When undocumented gang members in LA were arrested, they were promptly deported by the United States authorities. But this turned out to be a double-edged sword because violent criminals now started flooding the embattled country of El Salvador. Once in the country, MS-13 networked with local militias. They'd organize and gain even more deadly skills before making their way back to the United States, and the cycle would start all over again. When the El Salvador Civil War ended in 1992, the United States deportation policy increased, which overwhelmed the fragile new government of El Salvador with a hardened criminal population before they'd even have a chance to stabilize the country after 12 years of civil war. The gangs exploited the lack of an effective police force to grow in numbers and quickly seize the large number of loose weapons and ammunition left over after the El Salvador Civil War, both for their own use and for sale on the Central American black market. And it wasn't just the leftover weapons. Throughout the 1990s and early 2000s, gangs expanded their criminal enterprises and established a stranglehold on the population. The gangs of El Salvador extort business and the public, charging shopkeepers 10 to 40% of their income just to operate without harassment, vandalism, or worse. These protection rackets are called the rent or war tax, meaning control of the territory translates directly to increased resources. And so entire neighborhoods were deemed red zones by the police or off limits. Where are the gangs getting these weapons from? El Salvador has no domestic firearms industry. They don't manufacture any of their own weapons, so their police and military force has to buy them from the United States and China. And this is also where the gangs get their guns from, with 57% coming from the United States and 11% coming from China. And here's where the territorial control plan comes in. Ever since the rise of gangs in El Salvador, the country's fragile government has tried to reassert control over the situation any way it can. Past administrations tried iron-fisted police crackdowns, even legally defining the gangs as terrorist groups under a controversial law in 2015 that enabled harsher punishments of up to 60 years in prison instead of the previous limit of 20 years. Yet the measure failed to stop the gang violence. Other administrations tried negotiating with the gangs, offering better prison conditions in exchange for a truce between gangs and police. But these negotiated terms would only hold for a short while before something inevitably snapped and violence would resurge. This is where the controversial government reaction begins. When the government responded with a zero-tolerance policy for gang membership, MS-13 and other gangs responded by targeting bus drivers to cripple the public transit system that millions of Salvadorans relied upon. People lived by the motto, "See, hear, shut up," which was graffitied everywhere to remind oppressed residents to not report anything they see or hear to the police, or there would be instant and drastic repercussions. The diplomatic approach was also unpopular among the voting public, who felt their safety was being held hostage in exchange for whatever the gangs wanted. In 2019, that's when a young, social media-savvy Nayib Bukele was elected president on a strong platform of eliminating the gangs and restoring order. Bukele is often described in Salvadoran media more like a tech CEO than a stuffy politician, and his forthright, modern way of speaking through Twitter and YouTube